Today we are going to the late 19th century, so sit back as we go to London. Robert Coombes was born in London in 1882. His father was also called Robert and was away from home for long periods as he worked as a steward on a transatlantic liner, which meant that young Robert and his brother Nathaniel, who was born in 1883, were mainly brought up by their mother Emily. The family were known to be happy, and Emily was very proud of her two children. She was described as a very pleasant and helpful lady who always made sure that her boys went to school looking smart and that her house was always clean and tidy. In the 1890s, the family moved to 35 Cave Road in Plaistow, which is in the East End of London. The two boys had always been relatively obedient, but now as they grew older and as Robert had become a teenager, it was more difficult for their mother Emily to discipline them, especially as their father was so often away from home at sea. Robert was a very imaginative child, and he was musically talented. Many of his teachers told his parents that he seemed mature for his young age, but they were also concerned with his fascination for comic-type literature, known in Victorian Britain as penny dreadfuls. These were publications that contained many fictional-based stories about heroes, villains, and the supernatural, and Robert seemed to be reading them at every opportunity. Although usually a happy, bright boy, Robert also suffered from periods of anxiety. In June 1895, Emily's husband Robert returned home after his ship arrived back in London. Life seemed good. The family spent time together, enjoying the long summer days. But inevitably, he had to go back to work. And on the 4th of July, 1895, Emily said goodbye to her husband as he headed back to his ship. As usual, she was a little sad to see him leave, but she was comforted in the knowledge that she had her two boys and that her husband had left her enough money to provide for them until he returned. A few days later, on Monday the 8th of July, 13-year-old Robert spent the evening reading, while his brother Nathaniel, perhaps taking advantage of the fact his father had just gone away, started playing up. His mother was already a bit down. She was tired, and it had been a long, hot day. After a while, with Nathaniel continually disobeying her, she smacked him. Soon after, she went to bed. The next day, Robert and Nathaniel got up early, and after taking money from their mother's purse, went to the Lord's Cricket Ground to see a cricket match featuring the very famous player W.G. Grace. They returned the next day to see the resumption of the game. The boys continued to enjoy the hot summer days, playing outside with their friends and spending the money that their father had left their mother. Everything seemed pretty normal. When they started to run out of money, Robert decided to pawn some of his parents' personal items. However, he was too young to be able to do this, so he asked a 39-year-old sailor named James Fox to do it for him. Mr. Fox duly obliged. Around the 13th of July, neighbours started to notice that they had not seen Mrs. Emily Coombes for about a week, and asked for two boys if everything was all right. They explained that their mother had gone to Liverpool as a rich aunt had died and she was to inherit part of her estate. One neighbour, however, named Mrs. Burridge, thought it very strange that the boy's mother would just go away without telling anyone, so contacted their auntie. She was a very nice lady who was married to the brother of the boy's father and, strangely, was also named Emily, but to avoid confusion, was known as Mrs. Emily Harrison Coombes. After receiving the message from Mrs. Burridge, Mrs. Harrison Coombes became very concerned. She had gone to the house in Cave Road on 2 previous occasions, but no one had answered the door. So on the 15th of July, at around 6 p.m, she returned to the house with Mrs. Burridge. This time the door was answered by a man. He only opened it slightly, and when she asked if she could see Mrs. Coombes, the man replied that she had gone to Liverpool and shut the door. Neither Mrs. Emily Harrison Coombes or Mrs. Burridge knew who this strange man was, but luckily, as the two ladies turned to leave, they noticed Robert and Nathaniel walking towards the house. Mrs. Harrison Coombes instantly asked them where their mother was, and calmly, without expression, Robert explained that his mother's rich aunt had died and she had gone to Liverpool to sort out the estate. Robert and his brother then turned around and ran off to play in the recreation ground. Mrs. Emily Harrison Coombes, however, was puzzled. She thought it strange that her sister-in-law would just go to Liverpool without telling anyone and leave the boys with a somewhat strange gentleman. So 2 days later, on Wednesday the 17th of July, 1895, at 9 o'clock in the morning, she returned to the house at 35 Cave Road. She knocked on the door, but again there was no answer. This time, she was determined to get in. She would not be dismissed by a stranger or a teenage boy. She returned again at 1:20, and this time the door was answered by one of her nephews. Before they had the opportunity to say anything, she barged the door open and marched into the corridor. She looked around and immediately noticed that the property was untidy and had a horrible smell, which was strange, as her sister-in-law always kept a very tidy house. She made her way to the back parlour, where she saw Robert and the man who had previously answered the door playing cards. They seemed alarmed to see her, and in a stern voice, she asked Robert where his mother was. This time her nephew didn't seem so calm, and he muttered that she had gone to see a neighbour named Mrs. Cooper, and then offered to take his aunt round to see her. Mrs. Emily Harrison Coombes, however, did not believe what he was saying, and demanded to enter his mother's bedroom. Robert said she could not, as it was locked, and he did not have a key. She was becoming more worried, and very much more impatient. By this time, the younger of the two boys, Nathaniel, had gone into the garden through a window, seemingly in a very anxious state. Now that she had managed to enter the property, she was not going to leave until she had been in every room. She sent word to the landlady for the spare key to Emily's bedroom, and when it arrived, she went upstairs. She unlocked the door and nervously opened it. She was overcome by the most horrible smell, and as she peered into the room, she was confronted with the grisly sight of her sister-in-law's dead body lying on the bed. It was in a terrible state of decomposition and was infested with maggots. She could barely believe what she was witnessing, but despite her state of shock and horror, Mrs. Harrison Coombes managed to send for the police. Before the police arrived, Robert, who by now was feeling quite distressed, told his aunt what had happened on the awful night of the 8th of July, 1895. He said that his brother had been playing up and his mother had beaten him. Nathaniel was very upset and said he wanted to kill her but could not do it himself, so asked Robert to do it. Robert said that that night he slept in his mother's bed, and at about 3:45 in the morning, he got up and stabbed her. Mrs. Harrison Coombes asked if Emily was awake when he did it, and he replied, yes, she was, with her hand over her face. When Police Constable Robert Thwart arrived, he inspected the scene and immediately noticed a dagger-type knife on the foot of the bed and a truncheon-type object lying between the bed and the window. He was soon accompanied by the police doctor, named Dr. Kennedy, who, despite the terrible state of the body, concluded that the cause of death was a knife wound to the heart. 13-year-old Robert Coombes, his 12-year-old brother Nathaniel, and 39-year-old James Fox were cautioned by the police and taken to the station for questioning. As news of the crime began to spread, journalists arrived outside 35 Cave Road. They interviewed friends and neighbours and discovered that everyone considered the Coombes to be a nice and friendly family. The neighbours told the reporters that the two boys had acted completely normally during the previous 10 days. and none of them had any idea that the body of their mother, Emily Coombes, lay decomposing in the upstairs bedroom of her home. After intense questioning, the police did not charge Nathaniel with any part in the crime, and even though they thought that James Fox may have been an accessory, he was found not to have been involved. So Robert Coombes was charged with the murder of his mother, Emily Coombes. The sensational trial started at the Old Bailey in London on the 9th of September 1895. Despite his tender age, the prosecution were determined that the accused, if found guilty, should hang for his crime. The defence strategy was simple. They would have to prove that the accused was insane when he committed the murder. His father testified that his late wife was an excitable woman who laughed and cried at the same time. He confirmed that the birth of their first child had caused her much distress. He also told the court that his son had started to complain of headaches when he was 4 years old, and this was confirmed by the doctor. Mr. Coombes, however, when answering a question from the prosecution, said that there was no history of mental illness on his side of the family. The fact that Robert was so obsessed with reading penny dreadfuls was raised in the court and seized upon by the press. A new discussion emerged as to whether these cheap serial literature productions, which contained crime and violence, could have influenced such an impressionable mind. More witnesses were called: relatives, friends, neighbours, and the prison medical officer who had observed Robert's behaviour and mental state during the time between his arrest and trial. The medical officer was named George Edward Walker and had been observing Robert since the 18th of July 1895. He told the court that he had noticed a change in the defendant's behaviour around the 5th of August, when he started complaining of pains in his head. When Dr. Walker examined Robert's head, he noticed a very faint scar just in front of his left ear, which in his opinion may have been caused by instruments used at the time of his birth, and if they compressed the brain, they may have caused some mental instability. Nathaniel was also called to the witness stand to describe what had happened at 35 Cave Road on the 8th of July, 1895. He gave a grave and harrowing account of the events. When all the witnesses had given their evidence, the jury retired to consider their verdict. After an hour they returned, and the foreman of the jury stood up, and when the judge asked whether they found the defendant guilty or not guilty, he replied, "Guilty," with a recommendation for mercy on the grounds of his young age, and because the jury did not think that he understood the serious nature of his act. The judge, Mr. Justice Kennedy, instructed the jury to find distinctly whether the defendant was or was not insane, and asked them again to retire and consider their verdict. When they returned, the foreman again stood up, and when asked if they found the defendant guilty or not guilty, he replied, "Guilty," but added that the jury consider the defendant to have been insane when he committed the act. The judge then sentenced Robert Coombes into custody at Holloway Prison at Her Majesty's pleasure. Robert returned to his prison cell. He had been saved from the hangman, but soon after he was sent to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, where he became the youngest patient. He remained there until 1912, when at the age of 30 he was released after serving 17 years in prison. In 1914, 2 years after his release from Broadmoor, Robert went to Australia, following in the footsteps of his brother. When World War I was declared, he enlisted in the army, and with his musical talents became a bandsman and a stretcher bearer, and in 1916 he was awarded the Military Medal for conspicuous bravery in the field. After the war, Robert went and worked on a farm in the small Australian village of Nana Glen in New South Wales. He also gave music lessons to other villagers. Robert Coombes died on the 7th of May, 1949. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As per usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case